Have you ever felt alone, even when you were surrounded by people? Have you ever sat in a room full of laughter, full of voices, conversations spinning in every direction, and yet somewhere deep inside you there was this quiet, aching stillness, a silence that no amount of noise could fill? You smiled, you nodded, you maybe even laughed along. And yet underneath all of that, something felt distant. Something felt like you were watching everything from behind a pane of glass, present in body, but somewhere far, far away in everything else. If that lands somewhere tender inside you right now, I want you to know something before we go any further. You are not broken. You are not strange. And you are most certainly not alone in feeling alone. What you are experiencing is one of the most profound and least understood dimensions of the human condition. And tonight, we are going to sit with it together. We are going to look at it slowly, carefully, the way you might look at something fragile and beautiful that you have been too afraid to pick up. Welcome to the channel, Thoughts of Alan Watts. If this video speaks to you, if something in these words touches something real in your experience, take a moment to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Not because it matters in some grand algorithmic sense, but because when you do, you are quietly telling another lonely person somewhere in the world that this place exists. And that is a small and beautiful thing. Now, let us begin. There is a peculiar kind of loneliness that the modern world has never quite learned how to talk about. We have words for being physically alone. We have words for grief, for loss, for isolation. But there is this other thing, this loneliness that visits you not in empty rooms, but in full ones. Not in silence, but in the middle of sound. Not when you are by yourself, but precisely when you are surrounded by the very people who are supposed to make you feel less alone. And if you feel lonely when you are by yourself, the world has a simple prescription for that. Go be with people. Call a friend. Join a group. Get out of the house. And for a moment, maybe even for several moments, that prescription seems to work. The noise fills the silence. The presence of other bodies in the room seems to quiet whatever it was that was aching inside you. But then there is that moment. You know the moment I mean. You are at the dinner table, or at the party, or sitting across from someone you care about, and it washes over you again. That same quiet, that same distance, that same inexplicable sense of not quite being there, even as you are very clearly there. And you think to yourself, what is wrong with me? Nothing is wrong with you. But something is being shown to you, something important, something that most people spend their entire lives running from rather than turning toward. And the running, as we will come to understand, is precisely what keeps the loneliness alive. Alan Watts used to talk about what he called the skin-encapsulated ego, this extraordinary phrase. The idea that somewhere along the way, as human beings developed language and self-consciousness, we came to believe something that is not entirely true. We came to believe that we are a self, a separate, bounded, isolated self, that lives inside this body the way a driver lives inside a car, looking out through the eyes, operating the body, navigating the world, but fundamentally separate from it, separate from everything. And this feeling of separation is not just an idea. It is not merely a philosophical position. It is felt, deeply, viscerally felt. You feel it when you walk into a room and feel like no one truly sees you. You feel it when you are trying to explain something important to someone you love, and the words just will not carry the weight of what you mean. You feel it in the gap between what you experience inside and what you are able to express outside. You feel it as a kind of homesickness, but for a home you cannot name and cannot find on any map. And the ego, the sense of being a separate self, is not evil. It is not a mistake. In many ways, it is a marvelous and necessary instrument. Without it, you could not navigate the practical demands of being alive. You could not know where your body ends and the table begins. You could not make appointments, remember your own name, plan for the future. The ego is a tool, a very useful tool. But somewhere in the history of human consciousness, we mistook the tool for the user. We forgot that the self is something we do rather than something we are. And in that forgetting, we locked ourselves inside it. Imagine for a moment a wave on the surface of the ocean. The wave has a kind of individuality. It has a particular shape, a particular size, a particular moment of rising and another moment of falling. If the wave could think, and we are all in some sense waves that have learned to think, it might develop a very strong sense of itself as a wave. It might feel the sharp distinction between itself and the other waves. It might feel the space between itself and the shore. It might even feel a kind of loneliness in being this particular wave, this temporary shape on the surface of something vast and continuous. But the wave is not separate from the ocean. It never was. The wave is what the ocean is doing in that place at that moment. Its apparent separateness is real in one sense and completely illusory in another. The shape is real. The temporary individuality is real. But the fundamental nature of the wave is water, is ocean, is the same thing as every other wave, and as the depths below, and as the rain that fell and will fall again. When you sit in a room full of people and feel that ache of loneliness, part of what you are feeling is the ache of the wave that has forgotten it is ocean. Part of what you are feeling is the result of a very deep, very ancient, very thoroughly conditioned habit of experiencing yourself as separate from everything around you, as an inside looking out, as a self behind a glass, as something private and enclosed and fundamentally alone in its enclosure. And the harder you try to connect, the harder you reach across that perceived gap, the more the gap seems to assert itself, because the reaching itself confirms the gap. The reaching says, I am here, and you are there, and there is a distance between us that I am trying to cross. And as long as that is the fundamental assumption driving the reaching, the loneliness will remain, because you cannot fill a gap by trying to fill it when your very effort is what is creating the gap. This is not pessimism. This is not a counsel of despair. Stay with me, because this is precisely where everything begins to change. Very few people truly understand this. The experience of loneliness is not, at its root, about the absence of other people. You can be alone for years and feel profoundly, radiantly unlonely. And you can be at the center of a bustling social life, surrounded by friends and loved ones, and feel a loneliness so deep it is almost like a physical weight pressing on your chest. So the variable is not the number of people, The variable is something happening inside, something to do with the quality of your relationship, not with others, but with yourself, with this experience of being you. Watts used to use the image of a whirlpool in a river. A whirlpool is a curious thing, because it is made entirely of water, and yet it has a kind of identity, a kind of persistent pattern. If you watch a whirlpool for a while, you notice that it stays in roughly the same place. It maintains roughly the same shape. It has a kind of character. And yet, not a single molecule of water in that whirlpool is the same from one moment to the next. The water is always flowing through. The whirlpool is not a thing, it is a pattern. It is a verb disguised as a noun. You are like that. What you call yourself, the self that sits behind your eyes and experiences the world, and carries your name and your memories and your preferences. It is more like a pattern than a thing, more like a process than an object, more like a verb than a noun. And when you take yourself to be a fixed, bounded, separate thing, a noun among nouns, you also take others to be fixed, bounded, separate things. And the relationship between fixed, bounded, separate things is always a matter of proximity or distance. You are either close to them or you are far from them. You either understand them or you do not. They either see you or they do not. And from that frame, loneliness is always just one missed connection away, one misunderstanding away, one empty room away. But when you begin to feel, even dimly, even for a moment, that you are more like a pattern in a river than a solid object on a shelf, something shifts, because patterns are not separate in the same way that objects are separate. Patterns overlap, patterns interact. Patterns are, in some fundamental sense, made of the same stuff. You and I are not two separate chunks of matter floating in a void and occasionally bumping into each other. We are two patterns in the same continuous fabric of experience, two whirlpools in the same river. And what flows through me is not fundamentally different from what flows through you. Now, I know that this might sound abstract. I know that when you are lying awake at 3 a.m, with that hollow feeling in your chest, philosophy does not always seem like what you need. You need to feel held. You need to feel seen. You need to feel that someone, somewhere, actually gets it. And I am not trying to replace that with ideas, but I am suggesting that the very capacity to feel held, to feel seen, to feel understood, it rests on something deeper than the right circumstances, or the right person, or the right words. It rests on a quality of openness, a quality of presence. And that quality is not something you find outside yourself. It is something you discover when you stop running from what is inside. Let me tell you about a particular kind of social experience that many people know but rarely name clearly. You walk into a room. Maybe it is a party. Maybe it is a family gathering. Maybe it is just a casual social event. And almost immediately, before you have even said hello to anyone, there is this low hum of self-consciousness, a quiet internal narration that begins to run. You notice yourself noticing yourself. You become aware of how you look, how you sound, whether you seem natural or awkward, whether people are genuinely pleased to see you or just being polite. And as this self-monitoring intensifies, something peculiar happens. You become less present, not more social, less. Because the attention that should be flowing outward toward the actual people in the room has been redirected inward toward the performance of being a person in the room. This is what the ego does. In its desperate need to manage impressions, to protect the image, to ensure that the separate self is being perceived favorably by other separate selves, it actually interferes with the very connection it is supposedly trying to create. It is like trying to have an honest conversation while simultaneously being your own publicist. The publicist is always editing, always managing, always calculating the effect of each word on the audience. And real connection requires the publicist to sit down and shut up. Have you noticed that the moments in your life when you felt least lonely were often the moments when you were least self-conscious? When you were utterly absorbed in something, a piece of music, a conversation that lit you up, a task that demanded everything you had, a moment of unexpected beauty in an otherwise ordinary day. In those moments, the narrator went quiet. The self-monitoring softened. The gap between you and the world seemed to close. Not because anything outside changed, but because the thing inside that was creating the gap had momentarily released its grip. Watts called this the backward law. The idea, drawn in part from the Taoist tradition, that many of the things we most desperately want become less available precisely because of the desperation with which we pursue them. The more you try to be happy, the more the trying itself becomes a barrier to happiness. The more you try to fall asleep, the more the trying keeps you awake. The more you try to be spontaneous, the less spontaneous you are. And the more you try to connect with people in order to escape loneliness, the more the trying can amplify the very sense of separation it is meant to dissolve. This does not mean you should become passive. It does not mean you should stop reaching out to people or stop trying to build relationships. What it means is that there is a quality of reaching that comes from fear and a quality of reaching that comes from abundance. A quality of connection seeking that is really a form of running away from something, and a quality of connection seeking that is a natural expression of genuine warmth and curiosity. And these two feel very different from the inside, even if they look similar from the outside. When you reach toward someone from a place of fear, from the place that says, I am fundamentally incomplete without connection, and I need you to fill this void inside me, you are not really reaching toward them. You are reaching toward what you imagine they can give you. And people feel that, even if they cannot name it. There is a quality of neediness that, however understandable and however human it is, tends to push people away rather than draw them closer. And then there is the other kind of reaching, the kind that says, I am here, you are there, and I am genuinely curious about what it is like to be you. That kind of reaching is not desperate. It is not filling a void. It is an expression of aliveness, and it tends to create something very different, something much closer to genuine meeting. But that second kind of reaching requires a prior relationship, not with another person, with yourself, with this experience of being alive inside a particular body, in a particular moment, with a particular history, and a particular set of contradictions, and a particular quality of inner weather. and most of us have never been taught how to have that relationship. We had been taught to manage ourselves, to improve ourselves, to project ourselves, to compare ourselves, but not to simply be with ourselves. Think of how you feel when you are with someone who makes you feel completely accepted, someone in whose presence you do not have to perform or explain or justify, someone who seems genuinely interested in you as you actually are, rather than as you think you should be. Being with that person is easy, natural. The conversation flows without effort. The silence, when it comes, is comfortable rather than anxious. There is a lightness to it, a relief. What is it about that person that creates that feeling? I would suggest that the deeper truth is this. That person has somehow communicated, through their whole way of being present with you, that the gap is safe, that the space between you is not a threat, that you do not have to bridge it frantically or fill it desperately, that it is okay to simply be here, in this space, together, without needing to be anything other than exactly what you are. And when someone does that for you, something in you relaxes that is almost always tense. Some chronic holding on lets go, and in that releasing, you feel connected, not because they gave you something you did not have, but because they gave you permission to stop defending the boundary of yourself so fiercely. Now here is where it gets really interesting, really subtle, really important. That quality of acceptance, that capacity to be present with another person without needing them to be different from what they are. It is not ultimately something that someone else gives you. It is something that you develop through your own inner work, through your own willingness to be present with yourself in the same way, through your own practice of meeting your experience, even the uncomfortable experience, even the lonely experience, even the experience of sitting in a room full of people and feeling that terrible, hollow distance, with something other than resistance and the frantic need to make it stop. Watts spoke about meditation in this context, not meditation as a technique for achieving some special state of bliss, but as a very simple and very profound practice of learning to be with your experience without fighting it. The thought arises, you notice it. The feeling arises, you notice it. The loneliness arises, and rather than immediately reaching for your phone or turning on the television or calling someone to fill the silence, you simply notice it. You stay with it. You let it be there. And something surprising tends to happen when you stop fighting the loneliness, when you stop treating it as a problem to be solved and begin treating it as an experience to be understood. It begins to change. Not necessarily to go away, but to reveal itself differently, to open up, to show you something about itself that it could not show you while you were trying to escape it. There was an old Zen story about a monk who went to his master and complained that he was suffering greatly from feelings of loneliness and emptiness. The master listened quietly and then said, "Bring me this loneliness. Show it to me." And the monk tried. He looked inside for the loneliness, trying to find it so he could show it to the master. And as he looked, as he really looked with careful, honest attention, he found that the thing he had been calling loneliness was not quite what he had thought. It had a texture and a character that was interesting rather than simply terrible. and in the act of looking at it with honest attention, something in it began to shift. The master smiled, and the monk understood something that words can only gesture at. The loneliness that most of us experience is not simply the raw sensation of aloneness. It is that sensation plus a whole story we are telling about it. The sensation plus the judgment. The experience plus the commentary. And the commentary tends to go something like this. I am feeling alone. I should not be feeling alone. Something must be wrong with me for feeling alone. Other people do not feel like this. I am fundamentally flawed in some way that prevents real connection. And this story adds a whole additional layer of suffering on top of whatever the original experience was. It is the second arrow, as the Buddhist teaching goes. The first arrow is the pain. The second arrow is the one we shoot at ourselves for feeling pain. But here is what Watts understood and communicated with such particular genius. The self that is telling that story, the self that is judging the experience of loneliness as evidence of its own deficiency, that self is not the ground of your being. It is not the deepest thing in you. It is a particular pattern of thought, a habit of mind, a set of conditioned responses that you have been running so long and so consistently that you have mistaken them for who you are. You are not your thoughts about yourself. You are that which is aware of those thoughts. And awareness, pure, open, unconditioned awareness, does not feel lonely. It cannot feel lonely, in the same way that the sky cannot feel crowded by the clouds that pass through it. The thoughts and feelings and sensations pass through awareness, the way clouds pass through the sky. And the sky, no matter how dark or all-encompassing the clouds become, remains fundamentally open, fundamentally spacious. This is not just a metaphor. This is pointing at something that is available to you right now, in this very moment. Right now, as you listen to these words, there is something that is aware of the listening, something that registers the sound of the voice, the quality of the silence around the sound, the thoughts that arise in response, the feelings in the body, the whole texture of this present moment. And that something, that awareness, is not separate from you. It is the most intimate thing there is, more intimate than your thoughts, more intimate than your feelings, more intimate than your skin. And it is also, in a very particular sense, not enclosed. Awareness does not have an edge. When you are genuinely, openly aware of this moment, the awareness does not feel like it is happening inside a box. It feels more like space, like openness, like a quality of being that is not separate from the room you are in, from the light that fills the room, from the whole living presence of this moment. And in that space, in that open, aware presence, loneliness simply cannot take hold in the same way. Not because you have solved the problem, but because you have, for a moment, stepped out of the tiny enclosed room of the self-concept and into the open air of pure awareness. And in open air, the ache of the enclosed room is no longer the whole of your experience. I want to be careful here. I do not want to suggest that awareness is some kind of magic bullet that makes all your problems dissolve. Human beings need connection, real, physical, embodied connection. The touch of a hand, the sound of a voice that knows your name, the experience of being seen by eyes that have learned you over time. These things matter enormously, and the absence of them is a real pain, not an illusion to be thought away. But the physiological need for connection and the existential ache of loneliness are not quite the same thing. You can meet the physiological need through relatively straightforward means, but the existential ache, the ache that persists even in rooms full of people, is pointing at something deeper. It is pointing at the absence of a quality of presence, a quality that has to do with the relationship between you and your own experience, your own aliveness, your own awareness. Have you ever been with someone who was physically present, but mentally elsewhere? You are talking to them, and their eyes are slightly glazed. Their response is a beat too slow. Their body there, but their attention clearly somewhere else entirely. And you know this feeling from the inside too, don't you? You have been in conversations where your mouth was forming words, while your mind was replaying something that happened yesterday, or anxiously anticipating something tomorrow. And in those moments, even though you were technically with another person, there was no real meeting, no real contact. Because contact requires presence, and presence requires a quality of attention that is fully here, fully now, fully open. When you are lonely in a room full of people, part of what is happening is precisely this. You are not fully here, and neither, in all probability, are they. Everyone is partially elsewhere, partially in their heads, partially managing the image they are presenting. And the collective semi-presence of a group of people who are each partially elsewhere creates an atmosphere that is oddly isolating rather than connecting. It is like a party where everyone is looking at their phone. The bodies are together, but the attention is scattered. And where attention is scattered, genuine meeting cannot happen. Genuine meeting requires two people to be genuinely, simultaneously, actually here. And genuinely here means in your body, noticing your breath, noticing what you actually feel, noticing the actual quality of this actual moment, rather than the mental model of the moment you are continuously running in your head. Watts had a wonderful way of describing what he called the taboo against knowing who you are. The idea that Western culture has created a very strong social prohibition against the kind of inward attention that might reveal something uncomfortable about the nature of the self. We are trained from very early on to look outward, to achieve, to produce, to compare ourselves with others and measure our progress against external standards. And the one thing we are almost never encouraged to do is to simply stop and look at who is doing all of this looking. Because if you really stop and look, if you really sit quietly and ask with genuine curiosity, what is this experience of being me? What is this awareness that I keep pointing to as myself? What is actually happening in here? You begin to discover something that is simultaneously very simple and very disorienting. You discover that the self you took yourself to be, the bounded, narrative, name-carrying, history-dragging, future-projecting self, is not quite as solid as it felt. It is more fluid, more open, more continuous with everything around it than the usual sense of things would suggest. And this discovery tends to produce something entirely unexpected. Not fear, but relief. A profound, almost physical relief. Like setting down a very heavy bag that you had been carrying for so long you had forgotten you were carrying it. Because the self that feels lonely, the self that feels separate and enclosed and insufficient and misunderstood, that self is largely a construction. It is built from memories and expectations and comparisons and stories that we have been telling so long they feel like facts. And when you begin to see the construction for what it is, when you begin to have a direct, experiential sense of the awareness that underlies and precedes and contains all of these constructions, the loneliness does not necessarily vanish, but it becomes something very different. It becomes almost interesting, almost like a very vivid reminder that you have wandered away from something, that something in you has temporarily forgotten its own nature, and that the forgetting, while real, is not the final truth. Let us talk for a moment about the particular loneliness of feeling misunderstood. This is perhaps the most common and most painful flavor of the roomful of people loneliness. The sense that you are carrying something inside you that you cannot quite get across. Something about the quality of your experience, the texture of your inner life, that language somehow always falls short of conveying. You try to explain it, and the words come out approximately right, but not exactly right. And the person listening hears something close to what you mean, but not quite what you mean. And in that gap, in that unbridgeable space between what you experience and what another person can receive of that experience, there is a loneliness that can feel almost cosmic in its depth. This is partly a function of the nature of language, which is a blunt and approximate instrument for the conveyance of something as precise and interior as personal experience. Every word is an average. Every concept is a generalization. When I say I feel sad, I am using a word that covers an enormous range of experiences and pointing it vaguely in the direction of whatever it is I am actually experiencing, hoping that you will have had something similar enough that the word will create in you something like a resonance with what is happening in me. Sometimes that resonance is remarkably precise. You say something, and someone looks at you with that particular quality of recognition that says, "Yes, I know exactly what you mean. I have been there." And in that moment of mutual recognition, the loneliness lifts like a fog in morning sun. You feel, genuinely feel, that you are not the only one who has visited this particular interior landscape. And then there are the other times, when you reach out with the word and it falls flat, when the resonance does not come, when you look at the other person and see that they have received something, but not quite the thing you sent. And you feel, perhaps more acutely than you would have if you had said nothing at all, the distance between yourself and everything outside yourself. But here's the strange part. The longing to be understood is in some ways based on a misunderstanding about the nature of understanding itself. We tend to think of being understood as a binary thing. Either someone gets you or they do not. But understanding is not a destination. It is a direction. It is not a state of complete comprehension, but a quality of ongoing attention. And the quality of attention that someone brings to you when they genuinely tries to understand you, even if they never fully succeed, is itself a form of connection, perhaps even the deepest form. Think about the people in your life who have made you feel most understood. Were they people who always knew exactly what you were feeling? Or were they people who kept asking, who kept leaning in, who seemed genuinely, persistently interested in the particular quality of your experience, not as a project to be completed, but as a mystery to be continually explored? Being listened to with that quality of attention is not quite the same thing as being perfectly understood, but it might be better. It might be exactly what we are really reaching for when we reach for understanding. Not the completed comprehension, but the ongoing curiosity. Not the arrival, but the journey toward. But again, this quality of attention toward another person requires the same quality of attention toward your own interior experience first. You cannot be genuinely curious about the inside of another person's life if you are not on speaking terms with the inside of your own. The two are not separate practices. They are the same practice applied in different directions. Now let me talk about something that might seem counterintuitive. I want to talk about the value of loneliness. Not in a compensatory, silver lining way, but genuinely, in the recognition that loneliness, like all difficult experiences, is trying to give you something, is trying to communicate something important that you might not receive any other way. Solitude, real, chosen solitude, not the lonely in a crowd kind, but the actually alone and at peace kind, has historically been one of the most reliable sources of depth available to human beings. The mystics of every tradition retreated to the desert, or the cave, or the monastery, not because the world was bad and they wanted to escape it, but because the world was good and they wanted to understand it at a depth that the constant noise of social life did not permit. Rilke, that extraordinary Austrian poet, wrote that it is good to be solitary, for solitude is difficult. That a thing is difficult must be a reason the more for us to do it. And there is something in that worth sitting with. The difficulty of solitude is not a sign that it is bad for you. It is a sign that it is asking something real of you, something that the distracted, constantly stimulated version of your life does not ask. Loneliness, in its most difficult moments, is asking you to look, to really look, not at the phone, not at other people's highlight reels, but at the fact of your own being, at the extraordinary, improbable, unrepeatable fact that you are here, that this awareness is happening, that this particular configuration of consciousness and memory and love and fear and longing is occurring once in this universe and will not occur again, and that this fact, however ordinary it feels from the inside, is in some sense astonishing, deeply, quietly astonishing. And when loneliness opens you to that astonishment, when the stripping away of distraction and the falling back on the bare fact of your own presence reveals something that was always there, but which you had never quite seen before, it has done something for you that no amount of company could have done. It has returned you to yourself. Not the performed, managed, curated self, but the simple, aware, breathing, here and now self. The one that was here before the story started. And that self, the simple, aware, breathing, here and now self, is not lonely. Not in the way the story says it is. It is not enclosed. It is not a separate thing floating in a void and aching for connection. It is the openness within which all things arise. The awareness that contains all of your loneliness, and all of your joy, and all of your confusion, and all of your moments of grace. And that awareness is, in its nature, inseparable from the awareness that contains all of those same things in every other being alive. This is not mysticism in the sense of something strange or inaccessible. It is available to you right now, in this breath, in the simple fact of being here, in the awareness that is hearing these sounds. You do not have to achieve it. You do not have to earn it. You just have to notice it, and notice that the noticing itself is it. The awareness noticing itself, the ocean recognizing itself in the wave. Let us talk for a moment about time. One of the peculiar features of the lonely experience is that it tends to pull you out of the present moment, into the past, where you replay the connections you have had and lost, into the future, where you project the continuation of the loneliness, or the imagined relief of some future connection that will finally make everything okay. And in both of these movements away from the present, you lose access to the only place where actual connection can occur, which is here, now, this moment. The present moment is all that is ever actually happening. The past is a memory being recalled in the present. The future is an anticipation being imagined in the present. And the actual present, right now, just this breath and this sound, is often remarkably okay, remarkably alive. It is the story about the moment that adds the heaviness. The moment itself, met directly, without the overlay of narrative, has a quality of rawness and aliveness that is not loneliness. It is just here. Watts was deeply influenced by the Zen tradition's insistence on the primacy of immediate experience. Not to believe certain things or understand certain concepts, but to look directly. To stop mediating experience through thought and language, and simply notice what is here before the naming and the knowing. And in that looking, without the overlay of the conceptual mind, something is seen that the conceptual mind has been obscuring. Not something mystical or supernatural, just this, the extraordinary ordinariness of this, the sheer aliveness of being here, now, in this body, in this breath, in this moment. The Japanese word for this is suchness, the quality of things as they are, before we add our opinions about them. The feeling of loneliness in its loneliness, before we add the judgment that it should not be there, before we tell ourselves the story about what it means, before we project it into the future as a permanent condition rather than a present experience. And in that suchness, in the direct, unmediated meeting with experience as it actually is, there is a quality of peace. Not the peace of having everything resolved, but the peace of no longer fighting the moment, of no longer spending energy in the futile attempt to make the present different from what it is. And in that peace, the loneliness does not disappear, but it changes its character. It becomes less like a closed door and more like an open window, less like a prison and more like a particular weather. Weather that will change, because weather always changes. Let me now talk about the difference between loneliness and aloneness, because these two things are often confused, and the confusion leads to a great deal of unnecessary suffering. Aloneness is a physical and social condition. It means you are not with other people. And aloneness is also the condition in which some of the most important things in a human life become possible. Deep thought, creative work, the quiet examination of your own experience, the rest that only comes when the social demands fall away, the encounter with the quality of your own consciousness when it is not being shaped by the presence and opinions of others. Loneliness, on the other hand, is a relational condition. It is the experience of feeling disconnected, and, crucially, it does not require physical aloneness to occur. You can be deeply lonely in company and deeply unlonely in solitude. The variable is not the number of bodies around you, but the quality of your relationship with your own presence. Poets and artists and mystics throughout history have understood and celebrated aloneness in ways that the general culture has been slow to follow. They understood that the willingness to be truly alone, to be with oneself without the constant mediation of other people's presence and opinion, is not an eccentric preference, but a genuine necessity for any inner life of depth. That the person who has never learned to be genuinely alone has also, in a very real sense, never learned to be genuinely with others. Because the quality of presence you bring to another person is exactly the quality of presence you have developed through your relationship with yourself. And that quality of presence, that capacity to be genuinely here, genuinely available, genuinely curious and open and undefended. It grows in solitude. It grows in the quiet. It grows in the willingness to sit with your own experience without constantly outsourcing it. In the practice of meeting yourself, day after day, in whatever state you happen to be in, with the same quality of honest, compassionate attention that you would hope to bring to a person you loved deeply. Now I want to address something that might have been quietly insisting itself as we have been speaking. The objection that says, "All of this sounds very beautiful and very philosophical, but I am lonely in a very practical, very immediate way. I do not have people in my life who know me deeply. I am actually, practically, concretely isolated, and no amount of awareness practice is going to change that." I hear that. I want to honor that, because it is real. When you are genuinely isolated, what you need is to build connections, to reach out, to create the circumstances in which genuine meeting becomes possible. This is practical work. It requires effort and vulnerability and the willingness to be uncomfortable. But the philosophical insights we have been exploring can support that work in important ways. They can help you approach it from a place of openness rather than desperation, from curiosity rather than need, from the recognition that you are not reaching out because you are incomplete, but because connection is one of the most natural and nourishing expressions of being fully alive. Just as the tree reaches toward the light, not because it is broken without light, but because reaching toward light is simply what trees do. They can help you stay with the discomfort of the early stages of building connections, when the risk of rejection feels enormous and the payoff is uncertain. When you can hold that discomfort with equanimity rather than fleeing it, the process of building connection becomes less fraught and more sustainable. Let me talk now about the loneliness of the person who has been hurt, who has reached toward connection and found rejection, who has loved and been betrayed, who has opened and been closed upon, who has learned over time to keep the walls up because the cost of lowering them has been too high. This is a very particular and very painful kind of loneliness, and the walls make sense. They were built for good reason. They provided genuine protection at a time when protection was genuinely needed. The problem is that walls do not discriminate between threats and opportunities. They keep out the things that might hurt you, and they also keep out the things that might nourish you. And over time, the very protection that saved you from further pain becomes the prison that keeps you in the pain of isolation. Watts's answer was not the self-help answer of deliberately dismantling defenses. His answer was simpler and more radical. It was, understand what the walls are. Really feel what it is like to live behind them. Feel the full cost. Not just in terms of missed connections, but the moment-to-moment cost of living in the armored state, the exhaustion of it, the narrowing, the way it dulls not just pain, but everything. The way it mutes the color of the world in the same act of muting the danger. Because when you really feel the full cost of the armor, you discover something interesting. The armor was protecting you from a specific historical pain, but the armor itself has become a continuous, present suffering. You are no longer choosing between the risk of pain and the safety of isolation. You are choosing between the risk of pain and the certainty of a different, duller, more chronic pain. And when you see it that way, the choice begins to look different. This is also where the wisdom of the body becomes relevant. Not the intellect's assessment of a situation, but the gut-level, somatic, felt sense of whether something is safe or dangerous, nourishing or depleting. This wisdom is older than language, and in many ways more reliable than the analytical mind, and it is always available to you. But it tends to be drowned out by the noise of the armored, anxious mind. As that noise quiets, the body's wisdom becomes more audible, more trustworthy. The instinct that says this person is genuinely safe becomes something you can actually hear. Let me now speak about the stories we tell about ourselves. Each of us carries an inner autobiography, a narrative of who we are, where we came from, what we are like as a person, what we deserve and what we do not, what we are capable of and what is beyond us. This story feels like the truth about us. It feels like a report on reality rather than a construction. But it is a construction, partial, provisional, shaped by the accidents of our history and the biases of our particular perspective. And certain themes in that story can themselves be major sources of loneliness. Beliefs like, I am fundamentally different from other people, and they would not understand. Or, if people knew the real me, they would not want to be close to me. Or, I am too much, or not enough, or wrong in some particular way that makes genuine connection unavailable to me. These beliefs act as invisible barriers. They do not prevent you from being in the presence of other people, but they prevent the presence of other people from reaching the place inside you where the loneliness lives. Because even when someone offers you genuine warmth and genuine acceptance, if you carry a deep belief that you are fundamentally unacceptable, the warmth cannot quite land. It hits the story and gets deflected. The compliment is explained away. The kindness is interpreted as pity or politeness. The genuine curiosity someone shows in you is perceived as performance rather than reality. And you remain, despite all the warmth in the room, inside your own closed circuit of self-judgment. This is where Watt's insights become particularly practical. His answer would not be to replace the bad story with a better story. His answer would be to look directly at the one who is telling the story, to turn the attention around, away from the content of a narrative and toward the narrator, and to notice that the narrator is not you. It is something you are doing. Not the ground, but a figure on the ground. Not the awareness, but a content of awareness. This is the beginning of a very different relationship with your inner life. Not the relationship of identification, in which you are the story, but the relationship of witness, in which you are the awareness within which the story arises. And from that position, the story begins to lose some of its grip, not because it has been corrected, but because it has been seen for what it is, a construction, not the final truth about who you are. And when the story loses its grip, even slightly, something remarkable becomes possible. The warmth in the room can reach you. The kindness can land. The genuine curiosity someone shows in you can be received rather than deflected, because there is now a little space between you and the story. And in that space, something new can happen that the story, as long as it was running unchallenged, could never allow. Let me now speak about the loneliness of not being known. Not rejected, not misunderstood, but simply never having been truly known. Never having had someone who was curious about the full range of what it is like to be you, who could hold your contradictions without trying to resolve them, who could see your darkness without flinching, and your light without being blinded. This loneliness is one of the most quietly devastating and least spoken about, because in a culture that prizes performance and productivity, the question, who are you, really, all of it, is almost never asked. We ask, what do you do? We ask, what do you think? But the deeper question, the one that says, I am genuinely interested in the particular, unrepeatable quality of your inner life, is almost never the explicit subject of conversation. And so people go through their entire lives without ever really telling someone who they are, without ever having the experience of being fully seen. They have relationships, they have friendships, they have family and partners and colleagues, but in most of those relationships, only a portion of them is present, the acceptable portion, and the rest of them, the stranger parts, the darker parts, the more uncertain and difficult parts, stays in the box, unseen, unexpressed. And increasingly, as the years pass, unfamiliar even to themselves. The integration of these banished parts, bringing what has been pushed to the edges back into the circle of awareness and acceptance, is one of the most important pieces of inner work available to human beings. And it is also, directly and powerfully, one of the most effective remedies for the deepest kinds of loneliness. Because you cannot be fully known by another person, while large parts of yourself are still unknown to you. The knowing of the other person begins with the knowing of yourself. But when you can look at all of what you are, the contradictions and the strangeness and the darkness and the beauty, with honest, compassionate attention, something remarkable becomes possible. Not only does the loneliness of the unexpressed self begin to ease, but your capacity to hold space for other people's complexity dramatically increases. You become able to be with someone else's darkness without flinching, because you have been with your own. You become, in a real and practical sense, a safer person to be truly known by. There is something very important to understand about the difference between performing connection and actually connecting. Most of our social lives are conducted through layers of performing. Not lying exactly, but managing, presenting the version of ourselves that we think will be well received. And this performance is exhausting, and it is isolating, because the person being received is not quite you. It is your representative. And your representative, however skilled, is not capable of the kind of genuine meeting that dissolves loneliness. Only you can do that. The moments of genuine meeting tend to happen accidentally, in the breaks between the performance, when the pretending gets too exhausting and you drop it, just for a moment, and say something real. Or when someone else drops their pretending and says something real to you. And in that dropping, something extraordinary happens. The carefully maintained distance collapses. The representative steps aside, and two actual human beings, confused and hopeful and imperfect and trying, find themselves briefly in actual contact. These moments of genuine meeting are what people live for. More than success, more than achievement. What people are really searching for, underneath all the striving and the performing, is exactly this: the moment when the pretending stops and the actual meeting begins. When the skin-encapsulated ego dissolves just enough for the actual warmth and aliveness in you to reach the actual warmth and aliveness in someone else. And they are more available than you think. They do not require the right person or the right circumstances. They require, above all, willingness. Willingness to stop pretending. Willingness to say something that is actually true rather than something that is safe. Willingness to listen to someone else's something actually true with the kind of attention that makes them feel genuinely received. Here is a very simple question, and I want you to sit with it rather than answer it quickly. How often do you actually enjoy being yourself? Not performing yourself, not managing yourself, not comparing yourself to who you think you should be, but simply enjoying the particular quality of being alive inside this particular body, with this particular history and this particular inner weather. How often is there a quality of genuine ease with the whole enterprise of being you? For most people, the honest answer is, not very often. Because there is almost always a background current of dissatisfaction with the self, a sense that you should be doing better, being more, feeling differently, achieving more, worrying less. The list of ways in which you are not quite right is essentially inexhaustible, because the standard against which you are measuring yourself shifts constantly. The moment you approach one version of the ideal self, the ideal shifts. The goalposts move, and you are left again slightly behind, slightly insufficient, slightly wrong. And in that state of chronic self-insufficiency, connection is very difficult, because connection requires showing up as you actually are, rather than as you think you should be. And if as you actually are is something you experience primarily as a disappointment, the prospect of exposing it to another person is terrifying. What if they agree with the judgment? What if their seeing of you confirms what you secretly suspect? Watts used to quote the Zen saying, "Before enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood, carry water." The activities are the same. What has changed is the relationship to the activities, the quality of presence brought to them, the absence of the chronic second-guessing, and the wish to be doing something more impressive. Just this, just the wood, just the water. And in that simplicity, something opens. There is an equivalent in the domain of ordinary social life. Before self-acceptance, talk to people, feel lonely, wish you were different, compare yourself to others. After self-acceptance, talk to people, sometimes feel lonely. Notice the feeling without adding suffering to it. Be curious about others, rather than measuring yourself against them. The activities might look similar from the outside, but from the inside, they are entirely different experiences. Everything we have explored tonight comes down finally to a single, very simple, and very radical idea. The idea that the loneliness you feel is not evidence of a lack, it is evidence of a search. And the search, however genuine and however painful, is pointed in a direction that will never quite reach its destination. Not because the destination does not exist, but because you are already there, and the very energy of searching takes you away from the stillness in which that fact can be recognized. This is a very old teaching. It appears in different forms in every wisdom tradition that has ever addressed the nature of the human predicament. In the Upanishads, it appears as Tat Tvam Asi, thou art that. You are already what you are looking for. In the Sufi tradition, it appears in the story of the musk deer, who goes mad searching for the source of the beautiful scent that is emanating from within its own navel. In the Zen tradition, in the koan, who were you before your parents were born? All of these point at the same thing from different directions. They all point at the recognition that what you most deeply are is not the lonely, separate, enclosed self that is searching. It is the awareness within which the searching is happening, the presence that knows the loneliness, the sky that holds the clouds, the ocean that is the wave. And this recognition, when it comes, when it actually lands rather than just being intellectually grasped, brings with it something that I can only describe as relief. A profound, almost physical relief. The relief of setting down the very heavy project of being a separate self that is perpetually trying to fill itself from outside. Of recognizing that you are already enough, that you are already home, that the belonging you have been searching for is the very substance of what you are. Now, I want to be very honest. This recognition does not make you immune to loneliness. It does not make you stop wanting connection or stop feeling the ache of absence. These things continue, and they are good. They are the color and the texture and the warmth of being alive in this particular way. The Buddhist teaching does not say that wanting is bad. It says that clinging is suffering, and there is a crucial difference. You can want connection deeply. You can move toward it with all your heart. You can feel the pain of its absence acutely without clinging to it, without making connection the condition of your okayness, without collapsing when it is absent and grasping frantically when it is present. You can hold it lightly, with gratitude, with the recognition that it is a gift, like all gifts, temporary and precious, and not to be possessed, but simply received with open hands. And from that place of open-handed receiving, the connections you do have become richer, not because they are objectively different, but because you are fully there for them. Not half there, while the other half is planning or worrying or comparing. Genuinely, vulnerably, wholly present. And in that presence, the other person is also given permission to be genuinely, vulnerably, wholly present. And in that mutual presence, something happens that is worth all the philosophical inquiry in the world. Something very simple, very ordinary. Two people, briefly, genuinely meeting. And in the meeting, remembering together what they each, in their separate quiet moments, sometimes dimly sense, that the separation was never quite as absolute as it felt, that the ache of loneliness, real and painful as it is also a kind of homesickness, and that home is not somewhere else. Home is this awareness, this presence, this ordinary, extraordinary, unrepeatable moment of being alive. Let me also speak for a moment about the particular loneliness that arrives in the middle of grief, because grief and loneliness are close companions in ways that we rarely name clearly. When we lose someone we loved, when a relationship ends, when a friendship fades, when death takes someone whose presence was woven into the fabric of your ordinary days, the loneliness that follows is not simply the practical absence of that person. It is something more layered, more strange. It is the absence of the version of yourself that existed in relation to them, the self that was known by them, the self that laughed at their particular jokes, that could be quiet with them in a particular quality of comfortable silence, that felt seen and held in a particular way that no one else quite replicates. And that grief, the grief not just for the person, but for the version of yourself that existed in their presence, that is one of the least talked about and most real dimensions of loss. It is the grief of a self becoming smaller, of a world becoming quieter, of a particular frequency of recognition going silent in the room. And the tendency, when this kind of grief arrives, is to reach immediately for replacement, for something or someone to fill the space before the full weight of the emptiness can settle in. And this is understandable. The emptiness is genuinely painful. The silence is genuinely heavy. But the rushing toward replacement, like all forms of running, tends to prolong the very suffering it is meant to resolve. Because what is needed is not replacement, but presence. Not something to fill the silence, but the willingness to actually be in the silence. To feel the full weight of what was and is no longer, and to let that weight do its transformative work. Because grief, when it is allowed its full expression, when it is not cut short and suppressed and hurried through, does something that nothing else can do. It deepens you. It carves out a capacity for understanding and compassion that only comes through having genuinely felt loss.
The people who have grieved fully, who have not run from the darkness of it, but have allowed themselves to be changed by it, tend to have a quality of presence that is unmistakable, a quality of depth, of genuine understanding when someone else is suffering, of the ability to be truly with someone in their pain, rather than trying to fix it or rush them through it. Grief is, in this sense, one of the great teachers. Not a teacher you would choose, not a teacher you would want to have if you had the option, but a teacher nonetheless. One who insists on being heard, one who will not be bypassed without cost. And the loneliness that comes with grief is its own particular creature. It is not the loneliness of the isolated self. It is the loneliness of the suddenly enlarged self, the self that has been broken open by loss and now feels too big and too raw and too tender for the ordinary surface of social life. The self that has touched something real and now finds small talk genuinely difficult, because the small talk seems to stand between you and the thing you actually need, which is simply to be witnessed, simply to have someone look at you and know what you are carrying, without you having to translate it into words that are always inadequate to the weight of it. Very few people truly understand this, and so the grieving person often becomes doubly lonely. Lonely for the person they have lost, and lonely because the depth of the grief sets them apart from the ordinary tempo of the social world, which tends to move on rather quickly from other people's losses. The world offers its condolences and then, with entirely understandable but nonetheless painful haste, returns to its normal concerns, and the grieving person is left to carry something enormous in a world that has already moved on. And the carrying alone is its own kind of loneliness. What Watts would say to this, I think, is something like, the carrying itself is sacred. The willingness to carry it, to not put it down too quickly, to let it change you in the ways it needs to change you, is itself a form of honoring. Honoring the person you lost, honoring the love that was real, honoring the self that was made in relation to them, and that now needs time and space and gentleness to find its new shape in their absence. And in that honoring, something gradually, quietly happens. The grief does not disappear, but it transforms. It becomes less like a wound that is raw and open, and more like a scar that is integrated into the landscape of the self. Something that is carried not as weight, but as depth. Something that does not separate you from the world, but, in its own strange way, connects you to it. Because everyone has lost something, everyone is carrying some version of this. And the person who has grieved fully, who has allowed the loss to do its work, recognizes this in others with a directness and a warmth that the ungrieved self cannot quite manage. Let me now say something about kindness, about what it means to be genuinely kind to yourself. Not the performing of self-care, Not the bubble bath and the scented candle and the early bedtime, though these things have their place. But the deeper kind of kindness, the kind that says, whatever you are feeling right now is allowed to be here. The loneliness is allowed to be here. The grief is allowed to be here. The confusion is allowed to be here. You do not have to be somewhere else. You do not have to be feeling something more appropriate, or more positive, or more sorted. You are allowed to be exactly here, exactly as you are, in this moment. This sounds very simple. It is not. Because the deepest habit most of us carry is the habit of self-rejection. The constant, quiet insistence that we should be different, better, more, further along, less affected by ordinary things, more productive with our suffering. And this habit runs so deep and has been running so long that most of us do not even notice it anymore. It is just the background radiation of our inner life, the permanent low-level hum of not quite right. And breaking that habit, or rather beginning to notice it, which is the first step in loosening its grip, is one of the most important and most radical things a person can do. Not because self-kindness makes you more productive or more successful or more pleasant to be around, though it may do all of those things, but because it begins to create, for the first time perhaps, a genuine sense of home inside yourself, a place to which you can actually return, a quality of inner welcome that does not depend on having got everything right, or being in a particularly good mood, or having resolved all of your contradictions. Just this, just here, just this awareness, in this body, in this moment. Whatever the moment contains, whatever the awareness is aware of, allowed, welcomed, even in those brave and luminous instants held with something close to tenderness. And from that quality of inner welcome, everything changes. Not all at once, not permanently, not without backsliding and forgetting and returning to the old habits 1,000 times before they finally begin to soften. But gradually, in the direction of something that is worth traveling toward, something that is not the absence of loneliness, but a fundamentally different relationship to it, something that knows the loneliness for what it is, the wave, briefly, forgetting its ocean, and knows too what the remembering feels like, and trusts, even in the forgetting, that the remembering will come again. Before I let you go, I want to leave you with an image. Imagine you are sitting outside on a clear night, looking at the stars, feeling, as you often do in such moments, both very small and very large at the same time. Small because the universe is incomprehensibly vast, and you are a momentary arrangement of stardust on a small planet. Large because you are, in this moment, the universe being aware of itself. The only place in all of that incomprehensible vastness where something is, right now, looking at it and finding it beautiful. And the loneliness that you carry is there too, sitting with you under the stars. And rather than pushing it away, or explaining it, or trying to transcend it, you simply let it be there. You let it sit beside you, like an old companion. Not a welcome one, necessarily, but an honest one. One who has been with you a long time, and who, if you are willing to really listen, has something important to say. And what it says, if you listen carefully, underneath the aching and the reaching and the story about what it means, is something like, I miss the ocean. I miss the sense of not being only a wave. I miss the openness. And what you can say back, quietly and honestly, without pretense or performance, is, I know. I know you do. And we are going to sit here together for a while under these stars, and let the missing be what it is, and let the stars be what they are, and let this night be what it is. And in that sitting, something will come, not enlightenment, not the permanent dissolution of loneliness, not the arrival of the perfect relationship, or the perfectly understood version of yourself, but something quieter, and in its quietness more lasting, something that says, you are here, you are alive, this moment is real, the stars are real, and you and they are made of the same thing, have always been made of the same thing. And the separation that aches so much is real, and it is also the merest surface of something that goes much deeper, something that has no ache in it, something that is simply here. And you, sitting under the stars with your loneliness, are also simply here. And here is where you have always been.
And here is where everything is. And here, if you can be with it, without the need for it to be different, is enough. More than enough. Everything. The wave is moving toward the shore, and the ocean is moving too, and they are the same movement, and somewhere in that movement, without anything needing to be achieved or resolved or transcended, you are already home. Thank you for sitting with me in this tonight, for being willing to look at something tender, for bringing your own honest, uncertain, reaching, alive, imperfect, beautiful presence to this conversation. You are not alone in any of this. And the feeling that you are, it is not the final truth. It is a cloud in a sky that has never stopped being open. And the sky, always, is there.